Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Carrie Bourne. I am from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we have hosted the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services since 1983. So it's we'll start our 40th season in the fall. We're happy to be here. That's today's date. Today is January 23rd, 2023. So, yep, that's our very first, lecture of this series. This series, we are highlighting newer faculty and staff at UW-Whitewater, although today's presenter has been at Whitewater for a little bit, but she delivered this presentation last semester in a different location, and I think you'll really, really enjoy it, so we're really happy to have her back. This is Anna Thompson-Hodgick. She's a full-time lecturer in the English department at UW-Whitewater, where she teaches composition courses that explore everything from Midwestern identity to the evolving meaning of the American dream. She earned her PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin in 2011 and has always been interested in the relationship between American history and popular culture, especially how contemporary Americans make meaning out of the past. She is originally from northern Minnesota, where she grew up on a farm, and outside of academics, she continues to be actively involved with her family's farming enterprise. Please welcome Anna Hodgick.
All right, thank you, Carrie, and thank you so much for coming today. It's lovely to see such a nice big crowd. It sort of proves my point, I think, that Liberace still has the power and the appeal to bring people out. And so the title of this talk is Too Much of a Good Thing is Wonderful, Liberace's Wisconsin Roots and Flamboyant Visibility from Milwaukee to Las Vegas, all right? And when I was first contacted to put together a talk, I was kind of perusing, who are kind of some significant Wisconsinites. The theme from last semester's lecture was kind of rediscovering Wisconsin. And so when I discovered that Liberace was originally born in Wisconsin and then continued to have quite a lot of connections to his home state over his long and illustrious career, I thought, wow, this is just the perfect topic for this lecture series. And so here's just a little background on Liberace, all right? And so I realized this is the type is a little small, so I'll read through kind of the timeline of his life, all right? So he was born on May 16th, 1919 in West Dallas, Wisconsin. He was has a given name of, and it's tricky for me to pronounce, so it's Polish, Vladio, Valentino Liberace. He went by Walter before he shortened his name to Liberace. And later on in his life, his show business friends referred to him as Lee, actually. He was born to an Italian mother, named Salvatore, and a Polish mother, Frances. Liberace's father pursued music with a passion. So Salvatore was a French horn player that actually performed with John Philip Sousa's band. But, in the 20s, 30s, there just wasn't a lot of demand for French horn players. And so he had rather frustrating musical ambitions that were never quite achieved. And so that all manifested itself in not the best home life for Liberace and his siblings. And so again, Salvatore's passion outweighed his talent and outweighed his practicality. And so later on, Liberace would note in his autobiography that except for music, there wasn't much beauty in my childhood. So he really, again, there was just a lot of dissension and discord in his parents' marriage and then in that family life. But there you can see three of the eventual four children. George, Angelina, and eventually Walter, they were all very much encouraged to pursue music from an early age, and they did that with a great determination. So here we have Liberace at far right in an undated photograph from his high school days in Milwaukee. He went to Milwaukee West, and there you can see what we all know, right? As our Liberace there in the 1930s. To all accounts, he was popular. He was never, clearly an athlete. Really, he always stuck to music, right? But he was, he always kind of had this kind of affable, charming personality, which of course he hones much later in his life once he develops a career on stage and a career in television, which is how so many of us come to know him, right? Is on television, but he was very popular with women as well, and just again he managed to, even though he kind of had this, it's not the most PC of terms, but he kind of embraced what the term the sissy, right, a little bit, and that was something that endeared him to a lot of the young women in his class, and kind of led to boys just kind of sort of ignoring him or just not bothering him too much, because also from that early age he did show talent, right? He was incredibly talented, and so then he would be playing the piano, and he would play the piano for dances, and he would play the piano for eventually supper clubs and bars, and from his teen years onward, he started earning money, performing in music halls and supper clubs and the like throughout Milwaukee. So, also, I'm always curious in these great creative people, right? Who were their influences? And Liberace, he from an early age mentioned that this woman named Hildegard. Hildegard was she was a well-known cabaret singer. She performed many supper clubs all across the state of Wisconsin. She had been educated at Marquette University. And so she becomes eventually one of the most well-known cabaret singers of the 20th century. And Hildegard was born February 1st, 1906, in Adel, Wisconsin. Again, she trained at Marquette University School of Music in the 1920s. She would work in vaudeville as well throughout her career, appearing across the United States. Her career spanned the decades as well, much like Liberace's. And the title, The Incomparable Hildegard, was bestowed upon her by the columnist Walter Winchell. And so she was also nicknamed the First Lady of Supper Clubs by Eleanor Roosevelt. So what does all this have to do with Liberace? Well, Liberace worked for Hildegard for a time. He would help her develop her costumes. Here he is actually pictured painting flowers onto one of her blouses. And Hildegard was credited with starting the single name Vogue amongst entertainers, right? So it's really not that far a line from, say, Hildegard to Liberace to Madonna, really, right? And Liberace would later acknowledge her tremendous influence on his performance style. He wrote of Hildegard that she was perhaps the most famous supper club entertainer who ever lived. I used to absorb all the things she was doing, all the showmanship she created. It was marvelous to watch her wearing elegant gowns, surrounded with roses, and playing with white gloves on. They used to literally roll out the red carpet for her. And so again, she's someone that I really wasn't familiar with prior to working on this project. But clearly, here she is on the cover of Life magazine in 1939, right? So she was somebody that was, once upon a time, extremely famous in our society. All right. And so here's Liberace in 1943. So moving forward out of the 1930s, eventually, he realizes that, Milwaukee's only going to take him so far, right, professionally, right? And he has big dreams, big aspirations. And so he decides to leave Wisconsin behind for New York City. And in the 1940s, you had Los Angeles as the home of Hollywood, right? But New York was still kind of seen as, if you're going to go into the arts, right? And particularly if you're going to be a musician, that, that there was a little more cachet, right, to New York City. And so he goes there first, but he finds that he's really challenged in New York City. There's, so many other musicians competing for the same jobs, right? And he can't really find a way to stand out in New York City. So what does he do? He kind of switches things up, and he moves instead to Los Angeles, all right? And it was here in LA where Liberace truly began to shine, as he really transforms himself into a crowd-pleasing showman, and he finds easy work because there's a huge need for entertainers entertaining servicemen who were about to be deployed out to the Pacific Theater, all right? And so you have all of these, young men in a place like LA that, are demanding entertainment. And so Liberace finds there's really no shortage of opportunities for him in Los Angeles. And so that's what happens, all right? And so now we're kind of moving ahead here. I can't quite remember the story where he finally gets discovered, but it is in the late 1940s that he is performing. I think it's at a party. He's performing at a party, and he just, he has this really easy way, right, of relating to the audience, right? Kind of has this, this high degree of intimacy with his audience, and he's tapped on the shoulder by a young programmer working in this new medium, right, of television, all right, and one thing led to another, and then in 1952, the Liberace Show is born. And the Liberace Show, at first, when it comes on to the networks, is only a local show. It's only broadcast in the LA markets. But it doesn't take long for the ratings to sort of come in and demonstrate that, oh, hey, wow, we have something here that we should take national, right? And so, as I have on the slide, it says it was so popular that it quickly became one of the first syndicated programs and aired on over 200 stations. So it goes from one station in Los Angeles to then soon enough over 200 stations. At its height, it garnered more viewers than I Love Lucy. So it was the top-rated television show at the time, and Liberace received 10,000 pieces of fan mail a week, okay? And so this is, again, we have to understand, of course, that TV held a sort of different type of power in the early 1950s when there were only, 3 networks, right? And, of course, a lot of people, too, didn't quite understand yet how influential television could be, right? But Liberace, he figured it out pretty quickly, right? That TV was going to essentially transform his career. So we're going to take a little clip break here. And if you have watched the Liberace show when you were younger, you might have known that Liberace was very close to his mother, very close. And so when, I think it was in the 1940s, his parents finally divorced, all right? And so eventually, when he moves out to Los Angeles, kind of begins to have success, Liberace's mother moves out there, and she would live with him then for the remainder of her life. And so, here he is. Then you're gonna see the introduction, and then he'll sing a song about his mother. So.
you care for me. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for your wonderful welcome, everyone. It's nice to be with all of you again. Today, I'd like to dedicate my show to all the wonderful mothers that are looking in on us. It's no secret how I feel about my mom. I think she's the most wonderful person in all the world. And I've always felt that one day a year is hardly enough time to pay tribute to her. So I like to think of every day as being Mother's Day. So to start out our program, here's a little bit of advice that Mom gave me some time ago. I'd like to pass it on to all of you. When I was a boy, my mother often said to me, "Get married, boy, and see how happy you will be." Well, I have looked all over, but no girlie can I find who seems to be just like the little girl I have in mind. Well, I will have to look around until the right girl I have found. Like the girl that married dear old Dad. She was a pearl and the only girl that Daddy ever had. A good old-fashioned girl with heart so true, one who loves nobody else but you. I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old Dad.
A few minutes to kind of analyze just a little bit of what we just watched, all right? So, and then kind of talk a little bit about the, why this show, right? Why Liberace as a personality, right, was so appealing. And you can see, I think, here in this clip, right, that he inherently understands the power of television, right, as an intimate medium. He knows, right, that he's being broadcast into the living rooms of families all across the country, right? And he understands that kind of, and you can see just again how comfortable, right, and charismatic he is. He treats the camera as he would a friend, right? We're just having a conversation. Right? So that is one reason why Liberace found, I think, such success through the medium of television early on in his career. The other thing, and we kind of saw both of these elements in this clip here, is that he was able to really bounce back and forth very seamlessly between high culture, right, playing classical music with all this flourish, as we saw with the opening introductory number, right? But then he's just able to pivot so seamlessly into, kind of this, very like, I want to marry a woman just like my mom, right? That has a kind of almost this polka-esque sensibility to it. And then, of course, those are skills he honed right back in Milwaukee, like playing, knowing his audience, right? Playing in dance halls, getting that classical training with various piano teachers over the course of his young life, but then knowing his audience, right? And this is something, of course, too, that the critics hated about Liberace, right? That he was, that he would be doing classical music at one point, and then that he would, do the beer barrel polka in another breath, right? But that, of course, is what endeared him so much to audience, right? Across the spectrum, and so you can really kind of get a sense here of that performance style. So. How easy it is for him ultimately, right? And so back to the slides here, then, maybe. Yeah, okay. So then we have, one thing I want to also just make sure you all know, and some of you all may know this yourselves, is that, Liberace, as famous as he became, he never really forgot where he came from. Right, and so here, this is a photograph from his tour. He comes back to Milwaukee in 1953, and you can see the show, right, had debuted nationally in 1952. So his celebrity by this point in 53 has really blown up, as you can see there, just with the crowds of people sort of mobbing him there, asking for his autograph. Here's just another image from that trip, signing autographs, and again, just people just being so besotted, right, with Liberace, and him taking the time, right, with his fans. This is, I think, one of the great sort of undertold stories of Liberace is the relationship that he had with his fans, something that he clearly really cultivated. And he worked hard at that, too, I think, even up until the waning years of his life. But we definitely see that here in 1953. Here you can also see him with his siblings. So he's photographed at left with Frederick Miller, the president of Miller Brewing there, right? Then his siblings, Angelina, Rudolph, and George. George was his manager, I believe, or continued to work with Liberace. And I think all of his siblings were musicians in one form or another. And then one more kind of local image that's kind of fun. He becomes in the mid-50s the spokesman for Blatt's Beer, right? And the thing I think that's so interesting too, this really played up his Wisconsin roots, right? It says at the top, for those that can't see, it says, "I'm from Milwaukee. I ought to know. Blatt's is Milwaukee's finest beer." Says Liberace. Then further down it says, "My hometown Milwaukee is the brewing capital of America. So Blatt's has to be good to be the top beer in town. And Blatt's is tops with me, my friends and neighbors. It's Milwaukee's finest beer. In all my travels, I've never tasted as fine a beer." All right, and so, again, he was not shy, right, about advertising that fact that he was from Wisconsin, that he was from Milwaukee, and proud to be associated, I think, with Blatt's Beer. Of course, he was getting well compensated for that as well, but I just think it's an interesting association for sure. So here's Liberace then and his family at mid-century. Here's dear old mom with him, right? His mother's name was Frances. She lived to be 89 years old. Again, she would eventually, when she moves out to Los Angeles, she would live with him the rest of her life. And then his brother George was involved, as I mentioned earlier, helping Liberace with his finances, managing his schedule, that sort of thing. So, he was somebody that, this was, again, part of Liberace's appeal, I think, right? Was that fact that he was a mama's boy. And certainly this is kind of interesting in light of the 1950s, when we did have, it was kind of an anxious time. There was a lot of persecution against men that might have been perceived as homosexuals or men that were, in fact, homosexuals, right? Rooted out of the State Department, for example. And yet, Liberace was able to withstand a lot of criticism that came his way. And again, this criticism largely came from male critics, right, who questioned, say, his masculinity, questioned maybe why doesn't he have a nice girl of his own, right? Why isn't he dating? Why isn't he married, right? And he was able to withstand that criticism. My own belief is because he really did work hard at cultivating this relationship with his audience, right? Oh, he's just such a nice boy, right? This kind of perception, right? Oh, do we really care? He's just so nice. And look how he takes care of his mom, right? This sort of image that was very useful to Liberace. And so that, there's been some scholarship on this, right? And of course, Liberace was never out in his lifetime, right? It was pretty obvious, I think, especially later on in his life. But he would always just kind of, if those rumors got started, he would just kind of, and we'll get to another part of that here in a little bit. He would just kind of either not comment or just deny. That was sort of his strategy when it came to rumors about his sexuality. So then, in 1955, that's when Vegas comes calling for Liberace. And of course, he would continue to have his television show, but 1955 would mark the beginning of a remarkable relationship Liberace would have with the city of Las Vegas. And so he, again, would have that show, but his Vegas residencies would become increasingly common. And then from 1970 until his death in 1987, his presence in Las Vegas would be permanent, right? And of course, this was a match made in heaven, right? People could come, they could see Liberace's shows, and as those decades wore on, right, Liberace's outfits, right, would become more and more outlandish. Here, he's pretty buttoned up, right, still, and we're in the mid-50s. But we'll get to some images from his shows here a little later. And then I just talked about this, but the notion of his sexuality, right? So, Liberace's sexuality pretty much was an open secret in Hollywood, but it was still a secret worth preserving to the outside public, to those folks that were obviously outside the Los Angeles bubble. And so much so that one of the more of the tawdry tabloids in 1950s America was this tabloid called Confidential, and they would trade in information, and a common topic in Confidential was outing male stars, right? And then any kind of adultery, any kind of sort of tawdry scandal, right? And so in 1957, Confidential had a headline that they ran with titled "Why Liberace's Theme Song Should Be Mad About the Boy," is what it says. All right, and so rather than just letting it sort of kind of float out there in the air, Liberace banded together with another celebrity, Maureen O'Hara, and they take Confidential to court. And it was a libel trial. And in the end, the state of California brought criminal charges against Confidential magazine. But O'Hara, Liberace, and numerous other stars settled with the magazine out of court. And so there's a lot of more information kind of about that trial if folks are interested. I don't have it all kind of at the tip of my tongue right now. But it was a pretty salacious trial, and some people would say, well, why even fight it? You're just going to bring more attention to yourself. But Liberace, at that time was just not, clearly too, in late 1950s America, that would have been career suicide, right? To admit openly that you were a gay man in the entertainment industry, right? Even though lots of folks guessed, to actually have it be stated as fact would have been career suicide. So ultimately, Confidential magazine is actually brought down by this lawsuit. It ceases publication by the end of the decade. And again, O'Hara and Liberace did receive a settlement as a result of the allegations made in the magazine. So back to Las Vegas, all right? So Liberace, we start to really see, the longer he's in Vegas, right? the glitzier his outfits become, right? And so he has this residence at the Riviera, right? You can see, too, at this time, he's at the top of the bill. Barbra Streisand is underneath Liberace, right? And so he is, has this tremendous success with Las Vegas, right? And he's one of the first performers to really kind of make a habit out of the residency, right? Today, that's a common thing, right? But he is one of the first entertainers to really make use of that type of entertainment. I want to come back to kind of another key to his popularity as well, right? This idea of him being affable, right? He's just so, maybe he's not relatable, like in a everyday sense with those outlandish outfits, but boy is he nice, right? And that really comes through in any number of interviews that you can look back on. And whether he was performing on the stage, or whether he was performing with a Muppet, which he did several times, right? That affability came across, and even to some extent, this opulent lifestyle that he sort of performed in a sense. He made it almost a little more accessible, I guess, is part of my argument as well. He enjoyed the finer things in life, and he clearly enjoyed the wealth that fame brought his way. But again, he clearly enjoyed his fans, right? And he enjoyed the connection that he had with them. So my next clip then is from the Mike Douglas show, if I can find that here. He's, Get in, there we go. All right.
Mike's co-host for the week, and with us on today's show will be Little Richard, Faye McKay, the latest in fashions with Lawrence Kay, Joe Harnell and the band, and now here's Mike.
What a sacrifice those chinchilla men. That's beautiful.
You like it?
Yeah.
This
I want
is
you to stand up there so the ladies in the back can see it too.
This is a coat that was designed for the when I played for Queen Elizabeth for the Royal Command performance, and I had it designed just for that evening, and I was the only one there with one like it. Can I take it off now?
Yes. What is that? What is the material? I know the first.
It's called moire velvet.
Wow.
And it's chinchilla buttons.
You know, quickly, the ladies are going to be very excited. We have a delightful gentleman backstage by the name of Lawrence Kay, who's the president of Christian New York First. We're going to have a fur fashion
We're
show.
going to have a fur fashion show.
But like you've never seen it. Oh! So, would you play?
Yeah, I'm going to take it off.
Before you do, give me the album a minute, because Lee's going to play a special song, isn't he?
I wore something very simple underneath because you don't need anything much, you know.
Here's Lee's new album called A Brand New Me on Warner Brothers.
It's my first rock album.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What are you playing from this?
Well, I'm going to play the title song, Brand New Me.
Brand New Me.
Okay?
Okay. Liberace. I was just telling the audience, I want to tell our viewers, something very unusual happened last night. Lee has been in town playing the Latin Casino, so we had him out to dinner, and he had on a red cape and all red velvet.
Yeah.
You know? And it's a difficult color to get to match, you know. And my wife came to the door. She had Toreador pants on and a jacket with the identical material and color. And they looked at each other like.
I didn't want to tell you we're going steady.
The name of that song and that album is the brand new. There's a brand new. Is there a brand new Liberace?
Well, actually, it isn't that I'm so brand new. It's the same old me, just playing some brand new music, see?
It's good, too.
But I'll tell you what is new, my audiences. I have discovered there are a lot of young people in the audience, and they've discovered me, which is kind of flattering, you know, to be discovered by a new generation. I've lived through a few. And so lately I've been playing, you know, some of the contemporary music in my show for what I think is the young element in my show. But what's happening is the older people are liking the music that I play for the young people. And I had some of the young people come to me, and it's hard to believe some of them have never heard Gershwin before. You know, they've never heard Cole Porter.
I think that's what is a shame, is that they're not exposed to other types of music, just the one kind of music that they hear.
So they come to see me knowing that I do play music by Neil Diamond and the Beatles and Burt Bacharach, and then they're taken up with all the other music I play, which they're hearing many of them for the first time. And I had a couple of kids at the Latin Casino last night come up to me, and they wanted to see my costumes, you know. And so they came in the dressing room to get an autograph. They said, "Can we take a peek at your costumes?" So I showed them. And the one kid looked at these costumes. He said, "Look, Liberace, anybody who's so far out has got to be way in."
You know.
Stop that there. So again, another example here of just, you know, again, showing that kind of timeless appeal. I think that Liberace was sort of a master of. You know, and you know, yeah, and I think in Vegas, certainly his audience probably tended to skew a little older, but you know, still, you know, he did have this younger generation. He was always trying to innovate, always trying to. I don't necessarily buy that the song he played in that clip was rock and roll, but it was still, you know, it was trying to embrace a kind of, you know, a more contemporary sound, right, of the 1960s, 1970s. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So yeah, just talking about his the way in which he's kind of speaking to these different generations, that his cross-generational appeal, right, is sort of on display in that appearance with Mike Douglas. And again, you would just see that affability, right, when he's speaking there with Mike Douglas as well. Just more examples here of his affable opulence, right? You know, and how he, you know, he just kind of embraced it. He leaned in to all that opulence, right? And you know, one of my favorite quotes, my favorite Liberace quotes is, you know, especially when he would get kind of just raked over the coals by critics, you know, saying, you know, that he was, you know, kind of, you know, that he, you know, because he would play both classical music and popular music and kind of go back and forth between the two, right? And that just made those high culture, you know, music critics just, you know, so angry, right? And they spilled a lot of ink in the process. Well, Liberace's response to those critics was, "Well, I cried all the way to the bank," right? And he did, right? He did, and you know, had this again remarkable success. His association with Milwaukee, of course, continued into the 1980s. The picture at left is from Summerfest. So Summerfest still very much with us. in Milwaukee. He was the headliner that year at Summerfest in 1982. And then in 1984, he's pictured there with the mayor, Henry Meyer, when he was given the piano keys to the city. And in fact, initially his plan was to open a museum. The Liberace Museum was originally going to open, I think it was in Waukesha, but the deal ultimately fell through. There was an old mansion that he wanted to purchase and turn into his museum, but it all just kind of came apart in the 1970s. And so his museum then eventually opens in Las Vegas. Today, that museum is shuttered. Unfortunately, so we're going to get into some issues with Liberace. He didn't end up, some of the people he surrounded himself with, maybe were not the most trustworthy individuals. And so as he aged, some of his finances got to be sort of mismanaged. And it's not that he didn't die penniless by any scope of the imagination, but there was, when he did pass away, that money then was sort of mismanaged that was associated with the museum. And so the museum in Las Vegas closed probably about a decade ago or so, maybe a little bit less than that. And there are elements of Liberace's belongings. There are some in the archives at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. There are some that have kind of been absorbed into other sorts of collections and museums in Las Vegas. But it is kind of a shame that there was no the money that he did leave behind was not managed in a way that could really sustain his museum, unfortunately. And then we're going to come back to the topic here too of sexuality. All right. So in 2013, there was a film adaptation of kind of this tawdry, tell-all sort of memoir called Behind the Candelabra. And this was written by contemporary companions of Liberace by the name of Scott Thorson. And so he was a very young man when he first meets Liberace in the 1970s. But and I believe the memoir was published then in 1988, a year after Liberace's death. It wasn't published during his lifetime. So this film adaptation, and if you can tell here, but it stars Michael Douglas as Liberace, and then Matt Damon portrayed Scott Thorson. And so it did not, this is a film, a memoir, and then eventually film. It did not paint Liberace in a very flattering light. Now, it's very entertaining, but it did not necessarily do Liberace, his legacy, any favors, although it did kind of reintroduce Liberace to a new generation of individuals. So why should we care about Scott Thorson? Well, this is from a legal standpoint. So a really kind of interesting moment in legal history. The real-life Scott Thorson filed a $113 million palimony suit against Liberace in 1982. So while Liberace was still alive, after Liberace terminated their relationship, it was the first same-sex palimony lawsuit in history. So Liberace, though, continued to deny his homosexuality until the day he died. And he died of AIDS. So it was pretty, established, right, that he was homosexual. And, I think it was even just last year, there were new details released about Liberace's cause of death, right? So he managed to really keep kind of this veil, over his sexuality while he was living. And so I think the last thing maybe we could do is but I do have one more slide to kind of talk about kind of like the question of legacy. But let's see if I can. I don't know if I have it. I may not have that window open anymore. That's okay. We don't need to dwell on the tawdry, right? But it is, it is an interesting film if you've not seen Behind the Candelabra. Just in thinking about its thinking about its kind of the way in which it kind of updated the story for a more contemporary audience. So the final slide, though, is this kind of legacy of Liberace, all right? And he is somebody that is, so exceptional, right? In the way that he, embraced showmanship, took his act from the dance halls and supper clubs of Milwaukee, right? Eventually to Las Vegas. And this style that he embraced, this flamboyance, we see elements of that today. We have someone like David Bowie in the 1970s, totally embraced that kind of glam element. Elton John, certainly, right? It's kind of picked up where Liberace left off with these outlandish costumes, right? Good singing, great piano playing as well, right? But that extra bit of pizzazz, is something that certainly Elton John has mastered. And then we come to someone like Harry Styles, who's, obviously a much younger performer, but someone who's kind of, considers himself to be sort of gender fluid, right? Not above putting on that feather boa, right, when he performs. So I'll just end with this quote, that the public demands a certain amount of escapism and fantasy from performers. The ones who dare to give it are the ones who skyrocket, right? And so I think that ultimately is how, Liberace should be remembered, right, as someone who, put on a good show, but also loved doing it, right? Loved entertaining and loved his fans. So that's kind of the it for today. Thank you.